All right, let's get straight into the latest economic data out of China for November 2025. What we're seeing points to a critical inflection point. And to really understand the trajectory of the world's second-largest economy, we have to look past the headline figures and analyze the fundamental structural shifts that are currently at play.
So what's the core signal here? The central takeaway from this data is that we are witnessing a fundamental shift. This is not your typical run-of-the-mill cyclical fluctuation. No, what we're observing looks much more like a deep structural mutation within the economy. And that distinction is absolutely crucial for any accurate assessment of the current landscape.
Our analysis boils this down to four primary signals that really define the structural shift. First, there's a severe divergence opening up between supply and demand. Second, we're seeing a contraction in core demand drivers like consumption and investment. Third, there's a distinct K-shaped split between new and old economic engines. And finally, conflicting price signals are creating a significant profit squeeze for corporations. We're going to walk through each of these points.
Okay, so let's start with that core signal. The most pronounced feature in the November data, really the main story, is this widening gap between the economy's supply side and its demand side. And the data here presents a really stark contrast. You see industrial production growing at a fairly resilient 4.8% year over year. But then you look over at total retail sales, and growth is just 1.3%. This is the supply-demand gap in its clearest form. Production is simply outpacing consumption by a wide margin.
Now, the direct consequence of this gap is a decline in efficiency. The industrial product sales ratio fell by 0.8 percentage points. What that means in simple terms is that a growing share of goods being produced aren't actually being sold. This leads to an involuntary and very costly buildup of inventory on warehouse shelves.
Now, if we dig into the supply side in more detail, a very distinct K-shaped dynamic emerges. It's almost like two fundamentally different economic stories are unfolding at the exact same time.
The upper branch of this K is all about dynamism. You have high-tech and equipment manufacturing significantly outperforming the broader industrial average, growing at 8.4% and 7.7% respectively. And a key driver here continues to be new energy vehicles, with production up a very strong 17%.
This focus on industrial upgrading is really clear when you look at certain subsectors. For instance, the production of 3D printing equipment has more than doubled year over year. A jump like that is a powerful indicator of strategic investment in next-generation manufacturing technologies.
And it's a similar story with industrial robots, where we see a 20.6% increase in production. This just provides more evidence of an accelerated push toward automated and intelligent manufacturing. What's clear is that these high-tech sectors are beginning to decouple from the broader industrial economy.
But in sharp contrast, the lower branch of that K reflects a deep contraction. Here we're talking about traditional industries, the ones heavily tied to the real estate and construction cycle, and they are all under significant pressure. Cement, steel, and flat glass production all posted significant year-over-year declines.
So this brings us to the demand side of the equation, and this is where the weakness is pronounced and quite widespread. Let's unpack the pressures we're seeing on both consumption and investment.
In consumer behavior, a clear split has emerged. Spending on things like communication equipment surged by over 20%, probably driven by new product cycles. But big-ticket durable goods, especially those linked to the property market, saw severe contractions. This includes automobiles, home appliances, and building materials. It's a tale of two consumers.
And this demand-side weakness goes well beyond just consumption. Fixed asset investment for the first 11 months of the year fell 2.6%. The critical point here is that this negative trend has actually been accelerating throughout the year, which suggests a broad-based reluctance to commit capital.
Now, if we break down those investment figures, the primary drag is unequivocally real estate development. It plummeted by nearly 16%. Even infrastructure investment contracted. Manufacturing remains the only source of growth, but its modest 1.9% increase is nowhere near enough to offset the profound weakness we see elsewhere. And just to really underscore how severe this real estate downturn is, look at these three numbers. Development investment down 15.9%. New housing starts down over 20%. And the value of new home sales has dropped by more than 11%. This signifies a deep, comprehensive contraction across the entire property value chain.
So, this growing imbalance between supply and demand is now manifesting itself in some very contradictory price signals, and the result is a significant profit squeeze for corporations.
On one side, you have the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, which rose 0.7%. But that was mainly driven by specific supply shocks, like a 14.5% jump in fresh vegetable prices. On the other side, you have the Producer Price Index, the PPI, which reflects factory gate prices. That fell 2.2%. This divergence creates a classic scissors gap. Consumers face higher costs for some goods, while producers are receiving lower prices for what they sell. This squeezes corporate margins from both ends.
So when you synthesize all these different data points, a coherent macro picture starts to form. And the dominant theme, as we've seen, is a K-shaped divergence, a structural split that is cleaving the economy in two. So, the core conclusion remains that the November data signals a shift from cyclical fluctuation to structural mutation. This is not a temporary downturn. It's looking more like a fundamental rewiring of the economy's key drivers, and it all stems from that severe gap between supply and demand.
In this timeline for fixed asset investment really confirms the accelerating nature of this demand-side weakness. What began as marginal growth early in the year progressively deteriorated, slipping into negative territory mid-year and finally reaching a 2.6% contraction by November. The downward momentum here is unmistakable.
This leaves us with a critical question for the future. As these structural divergences between new and old economies, between supply and demand, continue to deepen, how will the new paradigm for economic growth ultimately evolve? The path forward will be defined by the answer to this challenge.